All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let us begin. So we are continuing today in Mesillas Yesharim on the Seder of the Hachzek program. That's why I sent out the PDF on the chat also. So we find ourselves today on in Parak Yud Aleph. Parak Yud Aleph is a long chapter, Mesillas Yesharim, chapter 11. So remember again that Ramchal is speaking over here on the Midah of Nikios. And in this Midah of Nikios, the Ramchal is focusing on this concept. Nikios literally means cleanliness, right? And in that Midah of cleanliness, the Ramchal is understanding that the goal in life is to identify the negative traits which may reside inside an individual and to uproot those traits from within me. The challenge, of course, that the Ramchal is trying to highlight is that sometimes there is negative behavior, sinful behavior that's so embedded inside of me that I'm not even aware of. Not even aware of. In other words, to fix the problems I know about, that I can handle. To fix the problems I don't know about, that becomes an incredibly acute challenge. So the Ramchal was going through the two averas that are the most common and persistent averas, gezel, theft, and arayos, immorality, which again, as I pointed out in yesterday's daf, was an interesting overlap between what we were learning in the Ramchal and what we are learning in Daf Yomi. So the Ramchal continues and he says as follows. If you're following along in that PDF that I sent out on the chat, it's page 63. So he writes as follows: V'hinei dibarnu mishtei gufe averos chamuros shebnei adam krovim lekashel b'anfeim mipnei rubam shel ha'anofim berov netias libo shel adam b'tavasu aleim. So up until now, we've spoken about. We've spoken about the two major averos that people go ahead and transgress: theft and immorality, because of the various appendages associated with both of those averos. But look what he writes: V'hamadrega shlishi. But there's a third category of sin. Achar hagezel v'ha'arayos. That's after theft, after immorality. L'inyan hachemda. V'hinehu isser ha'ma'achalos. Rabbi, listen to this. The Ramchal says that the third category of sin, which people often struggle with, is in the category of forbidden foods. I will say it's interesting because sometimes for us it's a little bit hard to relate to this specifically because of the proliferation of kosher products, Baruch Hashem, and the availability of kosher products in such a dramatic way. But this idea that Ramchal highlights over here is the taiva. Obviously, we'll say there's two things that man has a desire for. It's relations and food. So obviously this desire ultimately again for food over here is a big one. Ramchal goes on and he says, Kain, bein be'inyan basar b'chalov, ochel v'dan, ve'inyan b'shulei goyim, ve'inyan gu'ulei goyim, yayin nesikam, ustam yenom, kol inyan hanekios b'hem tzarech diktok gadol v'tzarech hizuk. Because most if you think about when it comes to the laws of kashrus, there are so many details. First of all, and he goes through the list over here. Treifus, which means obviously not kosher food. Taruv v'seyin, mixtures which have non-kosher components. Basar b'chalav, mixtures of milk and meat. Chela v'dam, forbidden fats and blood. Okay? Bishulei goyim. Remember again, even if a food is ingredient-wise kosher, but if it's cooked by a non-Jew, that is problematic as well. Ge'ulei goyim. Even using a pot that has absorptions from food cooked by a non-Jew is problematic as well. Yayin nesach, right? Wine even touched by a guy. Well, actually, yayin nesach refers to wine used in idolatrous service. Stam yenam, even wine touched by a Gentile. So the Ramchal says all of these are things that a person could easily transgress without even realizing. Therefore, the midah of Nikios demands a level of vigilance and diligence in avoiding these isurim. So he writes, Kiyesh tavas halev hamis avim ma'achal matovim. I will say it's incredible. The Ramchal says, and all kidding aside, what's incredible about this piece from the Mesillas Yesharim is it's very validating. Because many times we struggle with things and we think that our struggles with certain things represents a certain level of weakness. Right? If I was stronger, I wouldn't have these struggles. And meanwhile, the Ramchal spends so much time focusing on the struggle with immorality, right? It's validating because when we struggle with those things, which we all do in different stages in life in different ways, we begin to see that this is a natural struggle of the human condition. Same thing says Ramchal when it comes to kashrus. It's a natural struggle of the human condition. It may manifest itself in different ways, in different ways. So he says something interesting. He says, "V'chesaron kis b'isura taruvos kiyotze bazeh." Person wants to eat good food. That's number one. And number two. Sometimes there's a financial component. Why? Because sometimes the availability of the non-kosher items is much cheaper than ultimately, again, the kosher items. I'll tell you an incredible Mesillas Shahaya. I saw someone in the airport who I know, and he said, he's actually doing Hachzek. He was a little bit ahead. We were talking about this piece, and he said, I have to tell you Mesillas Shahaya. He said he was at the airport. He was at the airport lounge, and he was getting a glass of wine. Supposed to say, so again, even in Eretz Yisrael, when you're at an airport lounge, you still have to go ahead and check what the lounge does. The lounge has a hashgacha for certain things, but still with the wine, you have to check. And the guy was like, you know what? It's Eretz Yisrael. It's fine. I really need a glass of wine. It's not a problem. And then he stopped himself. This is a guy who's a frum guy. He's a frum guy, a frum man. I was like, what am I doing? What am I doing? I literally, again, it could be a whole variety of different issues. And because I want a glass of wine right now, again, he's like, I would never in a million years do this anywhere else in my life. And yet here, so it's just fascinating that, again, even a person who is vigilant and diligent with these things in his normal life could run into challenges in different situations. Uprateim rabim kechol dineim hayedum mevuaram b'sifrei haposkim. Fine. So then Ramchal goes on. He says, "V'hamekil bahem b'makom shomru lahachmir enu ela mashchis l'nafsho." And I both say, here's what's interesting. So it says Ramchal, let me tell you why taking shortcuts with kashrus is so incredibly dangerous. Because when I take shortcuts with kashrus, ultimately, again, I'm destroying my soul. Now I both say, I want to point something out to you. The Ramchal did not use that lashon by arayos, and he did not use that lashon by gezel. Right? We spent a number of days speaking about the severity of immorality and the protective fences that Chazal made around immorality. In other words, made around morality, to preserve morality. Yet here, the Ramchal says that a person who takes shortcuts with kashrus is destroying his soul. He says, "V'kach amru lo titamu bahem v'nitmeisem bam imitamim atem bam sofchem litamei bam." What does this mean? Ki ha'ma'achalos ha'asuros machnisim tuma mamish belibo ubenafsho shel adam ad shekidushaso kshal hamakom baruch hu mistalek es ubarach es mimenu. So I say, here's the difference when it comes to kashrus. When a person consumes something non-kosher, what are they doing? They're ingesting something tameh. I'm putting something tameh into my body. That's very different than most averos. If you think about it, when I sin most of the time, where does the sin take place? Where does it take place? Externally. Even arayos, right? Which is so severe that Ramchal spoke about. But the avera is klapi chutz. It's on the outside. When a person ingests non-kosher food, what they're doing is they're bringing the avera literally into their body. So the Ramchal says, therefore, and what happens as a result of that? The Kiddusha, so once I bring Tumah into my body, the Shechina cannot reside inside of me. The Shechina can't reside in a place where ultimately, again, there's such profound and systemic Tumah. The Gam came v'net meisem bam, al tikri v'net meisem bam ella v'nitamtem. So this is actually interesting. So the Gemara has a little bit of a drush over here. When the Torah speaks about tarfas and it says v'nit meisem bam, you become impure. Don't read it v'nit meisem ella v'nitamtem. Rabbi say timtum means almost like a closing off or an ambiguity. Shavera mitamtemes libo shel adam. What does an avera do? In general, what an avera does is it creates a certain sense of spiritual bewilderment. It drains me of any life clarity. Suddenly, again, I'm closed off from being able to see things in a clear and objective and truthful fashion. Because again, this is a general statement when it comes to sin. That the profundity, the power, and the destructive nature of sin removes clarity. I will say, we know this. We all know this from our own lives. I will say, you ever have like a period of time where you're firing on all cylinders. You're doing what you're supposed to be doing. You're davening the way you're supposed to be davening. You're learning. You're giving stuff. You're doing chesed. You have a certain level of clarity in life. Like, the world makes sense to me. My life makes sense to me. What I have to do, where I have to go, how I have to, it makes sense to me. And then what happens? Conversely, when I know that I'm doing Averos, suddenly again everything is gray. Everything is great. I have no clarity about myself, about my direction, about my life. And therefore, again, the Ramchal says over here, that halacha l'maisa, when a person consumes non-kosher items, so what ends up happening? So he's ingesting tumah. By ingesting tumah, the Shechina itself has to leave, right? That same space that the Shechina occupied, now the non-kosher food occupies. The Shechina has to leave. Once the Shechina leaves, what happens? No clarity. No clarity. V'hinei, hu nishar b'hami v'chumri mishuka b'gasus ha'olam hazeh. Now obviously, once the Shechina is gone, so what do I have? What do I have? Once the Shekhinah is gone, all I have is the physicality of this world. There's no spiritual lodestar, right? There's no spiritual GPS. There's no spiritual guide, right? So all I have is the animalistic physicality about me. Now I want to point out, what the Ramchal was describing over here, truthfully, is in effect with all Averos. All Averos. So I was saying, I feel like we've spoken about this before in Reb Tzadok as well. The real ramification, negative ramification of sin is not simply, we often think what's terrible about sin is onesh. Every hate comes with an onesh. Every sin comes with a punishment. Now again, we saw in the beginning of Mesillas Yesharim, whether HaKadosh Baruch Hu executes on that punishment, immediately delays, that's a whole different cheshbon. But every hate comes with an onesh. So we often think the worst thing about hate is the onesh. It's not true. The worst thing about hate is a total lack of life clarity. When I sin, I cloud everything. Because when I sin, by definition, the Shekhinah cannot exist in that space, at least for that moment. When that happens, I have no clarity. When I have no clarity, that usually leads me to make more mistakes. Ramchal says that's true by every sin. We'll end off with this. He says, but again, when it comes to kashrus, failure to observe the laws of kashrus is a compounded avera. Why? So I will say, this is the dynamic that he's describing that happens with every sin. Alachas kama v'kama when it comes to kashrus. Why? Because if a person goes ahead and consumes non-kosher food, they're literally going ahead and ingesting the dvar havera into them. So with every other avera, at least the limud zchus, the saving grace, is the fact that the avera is external. But when it comes ultimately again to the laws of kashrus or failure to observe the laws of kashrus, the problem is that now I've made the avera part of my body, literally, physically part of my body. So whatever negative effects sin normally has, so transgression of the laws of kashrus has a compounded negative effect because the avera is mamish entered into the core of who and what I am. I will stop over here for today. Continue with this theme of Mesillas Yesharim tomorrow. Shkoyach.